All right, so the title of the panel is Banned Books from Before the Cold War to the Present. And our first speaker is Nicole Gonik. She is a James Gaither Junior Fellow for the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She received her BA from Hunter College in 2023, double majoring in Russian language and culture and political science, and minoring in international relations. For the past 2 years, Nicole has been learning about banned books as a volunteer for Tamizdat project. She is an incoming PhD student at the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of California, Berkeley. Congratulations on that. All right, so the floor is yours.
All right, thank you everyone for listening to my presentation. I will be talking about how manuscripts don't burn and how Master Margarita wrote its own publication history. Manuscripts don't burn. This quote, perhaps one of the most famous lines from Mikhail Bulgakov's Master Margarita, embodies not only the themes and storyline of the novel, but also its creation and publication history. Bulgakov began writing the novel in the late 1920s and worked on it almost until his death in 1940, with the full understanding that it would be unpublishable under Soviet censorship, much like the opus of the fictional master within the novel. But both Master Margarita and the narrative embedded in it did see the light of day, first in a cut, censored version in Tamizdat, and later uncensored in Tamizdat. The fictional novel is reincarnated from ashes by Woland, the quote-unquote foreign professor and actually the devil visiting Moscow, though it could not have happened without the love and devotion of the book's heroine, Margarita. Meanwhile, the Tamizdat and Tamizdat publications of the real novel only came into being after years of tireless efforts by Ilyana Bulgakova, the author's widow. This presentation will explore these and other parallels between the novel's plot and its publication history, demonstrating how Master Margarita presents a model, not only for its own border-crossing journey from an unpublishable text to one of the most celebrated works of Russian literary canon, but for Tamizdat as a whole, long before the practice became cemented in history. So as Bulgakov began writing Master Margarita, he was getting some personal experience being published in the West. And though these publications were not banned or examples of Tamizdat, they did, in classic Tamizdat fashion, occasionally occur without his knowledge or consent. In 1927, the publisher Zacharie Kagansky, claiming to be acting with Bulgakov's permission, began publishing The White Guard and Days of the Turbans in the West. Bulgakov actively protested against this and even tried, unsuccessfully, to get permission to go abroad, supposedly to sort out this matter. Nevertheless, the following year, he did conclude a contract with the German publishing house Fischer Verlag regarding the play Days of the Turban, transferring them the rights to control the theatrical fate of the play in Europe and the United States. Throughout the early 1930s, Bulgakov would often write to this publishing house, mostly trying to get them to pay him his royalties, which they seemed unwilling to do. But more importantly, for the purposes of this presentation, at least once, he refused to send them the play Flight, Biek, presumably after being asked for it, because it was banned in the Soviet Union. So, while writing Master Margarita, he was faced with at least one chance to publish a banned work abroad. And though he did not take this chance, one can imagine that the temptation must have been strong. Bulgakov also had the personal experience of having his work changed in translations published abroad, like so many Tamizdat authors would decades later. For example, in the letter you can see above, he asks his brother Nikolai, who lived in France, to remove from the French translation of the play Zoyka's Apartment a line that was apparently invented by the French translator, a line featuring Lenin and Stalin's names, no less, which Bulgakov refers to as a violation. The idea of being published incorrectly manifests itself in chapter 2 of Master Margarita, when Yeshua tells Pontius Pilate that he is being followed by a man who writes down everything he says on parchment, but that, quote, absolutely nothing from what is written there, end quote, matches what he actually says. So the works that Bulgakov actually had published abroad at this time may not have been banned or Tamizdat, but the idea, mechanics, and even potential problems of publishing abroad to escape Soviet censorship must have been on his mind from the early stages of working on Master Margarita. Bulgakov also had significant personal experience with foreigners, something that is clearly reflected in the novel, the first chapter of which introduces Woland, the foreign professor and actually the devil visiting Moscow. Woland and his retinue largely act as bringers of justice in Soviet Moscow. They expose social ills and idiosyncrasies and punish corruption and greed. Woland also manifests into being the master's previously burned novel, enabling its publication, so to speak, like so many foreign visitors to the Soviet Union would do years later when participating in the process of Tamizdat publications by smuggling manuscripts over Soviet borders. In many cases, these future visitors would be foreign diplomats, and there's a strong case that the character of Woland was at least partially inspired by one particular foreign diplomat who Bulgakov knew personally. That would be William Bullitt, the first US ambassador to the Soviet Union. The relationship between the two men and the argument that Woland is based on Bullitt is laid out in Alexander Etkin's Roads Not Taken, an intellectual biography of William C. Bullitt. Etkin particularly details the night of Bullitt's wild embassy ball on April 23, 1935, which Bulgakov attended and used as inspiration for Woland's ball in the novel. There's no evidence yet that Bullitt ever participated in the publication of any Tamizdat or banned materials, but future diplomats would, a fact that Bulgakov modeled by making the supernatural quote-unquote foreigners in Master Margarita facilitate the, so to speak, publication of the master's novel. The publishing history of Master Margarita defies certain expectations of what a Tamizdat story looks like in at least three ways, all of which somehow mirror the plot of the novel. The first is that the master's novel, just like the real Master Margarita, was first published in Gosizdat. In the novel, the master's troubles begin when, quote, some other editor published a large excerpt from the novel of him who called himself the master, end quote. This first leads to a flurry of critics attacking him, and that eventually leads to him being arrested and driven to madness. When Margarita transforms into a witch and flies through Moscow later in the novel, she makes a stop to destroy the apartment of Latunsky, a particularly vicious one of these critics. Based on Elena Bulgakova's statement in her diary about the writers, critics, and journalists who, in her view, quote, doomed her husband, it seems that she shared the fictional Margarita's sentiments and even word choice, if not her methods. What Elena Bulgakova did do was prepare a complete manuscript of her husband's novel after his death and get it published. As was the case with the fictional novel, this first occurred in Gosizdat in the journal Moskva. It came out in 2 volumes, the first half of the novel in 1966 and the second half in 1967. It was personally suggested to the journal by Konstantin Simonov, author, poet, editor-in-chief of multiple literary journals, secretary of the Soviet Union of Writers, overall an immensely powerful figure in the world of official Soviet publishing. Of course, just as only a section of the master's novel was published in the book, only a censored version of the novel came out in Moscow. Approximately 12% of the novel was cut, and most of the cuts seemed to have clear political motivations. For example, anything referencing arrests by the secret police is cut out, as is Basoy's dream with the foreign currency and the more raunchy bits of Margarita's flight. One can imagine how painful the cuts would have been for Bulgakov, given his previously demonstrated sensitivity to changes being made to his work, and how painful they were for Elena. In the introduction to Elena's diary, her personal friend, longtime Bulgakov researcher and compiler of the diary, Lydia Yanovskaya, states that Elena was, quote, endlessly dedicated to the manuscript as a document, and that when Elena was compiling and preparing Bulgakov's work, she refused to make any changes whatsoever, even to fix completely minor, obvious, and glaring errors. Nevertheless, she followed Konstantin Simonov's advice and not only agreed to the cuts, but even insisted that they were made for reasons of space in the journal rather than just censorship. In other words, she played the role that she had to play to see the novel get published, just as Margarita played the exhausting and arduous role of Queen of Woland's Ball for the sake of the master and his novel. And this strategy paid off, because the second unexpected factor in the novel's publications in Tamizdat is that the novel's publications in Tamizdat happened with the blessing and even aid of the official world of Soviet publishing. In October of 1967, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union received a letter from the Soviet Union of Writers stating that the Italian publishing house Einaudi wanted to publish the full text of Master Margarita. The union recommended allowing the full publication, including the pages that were not published in Moscow. The letter was signed by an assistant of Simonov's, and Simonov was secretary of the union at the time. The request was granted, and after this, according to Yanovska, Elena Bulgakova and her friends were, quote, no longer afraid, end quote, of distributing the cut fragments. Thus, it was no surprise that they made their way abroad and into Tamizdat publications, which were uncensored, like the French YMCA presses in 1967 or the German Pasievs in 1969. While the actual physical process of how each publishing house received the manuscripts remains a question for further research, there is no doubt that the enabling factor was the blessing and aid of Simonov, a figure whose status in the Soviet literary world was almost akin to the supernatural status of Woland. Finally, if there was any publication of Master Margarita that occurred in a manner more expected for a Tamizdat story, it was not a Tamizdat publication at all. It was, in fact, the Gosizdat publication made by the Estonian publishing house Estiramat, the Estonian translation. In her article on the Estonian translations of Master Margarita, Sergei Kupsazanov explains that Estiramat's team of translators and editors exploited a legal loophole that allowed books already published in Russian in the Soviet Union to be translated into other languages of Soviet countries without the approval of Glavlit, the Soviet censorship body. After reading the first half of the novel in the 1966 Moscow edition, the editor-in-chief of Estiramat, Axel Tom, traveled to Moscow, obtained a copy of the second half, and the Estiramat team spent a year translating, editing, and preparing both parts for publication as a book while keeping the whole endeavor secret. It was not reflected in official Estiramat publication plans. It was never approved by Glavlit, and it was never revealed to Elena Bulgakova, though she was shown the publication post factum and appreciated it enough to, in return, show Estiramat's editor-in-chief the uncensored Tamizdat publications of the novel that she had in return. They ended up publishing the translation in 1968. It was the first time that the novel was published in the Soviet Union as a book rather than a journal. Immediately after the publication came out, the editor-in-chief and two Estonian party officials responsible for propaganda and publishing matters were summoned to the Moscow Glavlit for an explanation. They were told that, quote, just because Moscow once allowed the novel to be published in the journal here does not mean that all the republics have the right to publish translations of it over there. Glavlit also demanded that copies of the translation be removed from stores, but Estiramat avoided this by claiming that all the copies were already sold, which, as Kupsazanov diplomatically states in her article, was, quote, not entirely true, end quote. Eventually, the publishing house was able to avoid any major consequences for their daring endeavor, but it is ironic that they, while publishing a perfectly legal translation of the censored text within the Soviet Union, were really taking far more risks and faced with more official blowback than those involved in Tamizdat publications of the novel. In this case, Estonia functions as a sort of peripheral in-between space that is conceptually reflected in the novel. On the one hand, the over here, over there reasoning from Glavlit shows that this space was clearly treated as somehow less worthy of having a publication that is perfectly legal in Moscow. In other words, it is othered, made distinct and foreign. On the other hand, it is within the Soviet Union and subject to Soviet jurisdiction. And yet, the publication of the novel there was treated as a bigger subversion than all the actually foreign publications. As Korolev says to Margarita when preparing her for her role as Queen of Satan's Ball, quote, there are some matters in which even the borders between states do not function at all. And the borders between states certainly did not function as expected or ordained in the case of the Estonian translation. This concept of a paradoxical in-between borderland space is extremely important within Master Margarita. For example, the final resting place that the Master and Margarita end up in after drinking Azazel's poisoned wine can be called such an in-between peripheral space. It is neither heaven nor hell, neither light nor dark, but in the vague words of Woland, quote-unquote, peace. The plot of the novel relies on there being a space between good and evil, light and dark, supernatural and real, early Soviet Moscow and ancient Jerusalem. And just like that, the novel's publication history, and particularly this last Estonian translation, occupies in-between spaces as well, between Soviet and foreign, Gosizdat and Tamizdat, authorized and banned. Of course, none of these parallels are meant to be equivalencies. Bulgakov is not the Master, Elena is not Margarita, and Woland is certainly neither Bullet nor Simonov. But if the spirit and idea of how a manuscript can go from unpublishable to published, thanks to the tireless efforts of one truly dedicated to it and some foreign assistance, if this idea was not woven into the fabric of the novel, and likely informed by the experience and temptations Bulgakov had with foreign publishers in real life, then none of these roles or parallels would fit at all. On a final and perhaps sentimental note, there is one very significant disparity between the novel and its history. The fictional master, in the end, hated the novel that brought him so much pain and suffering, and wanted nothing to do with it even when it was physically given to him, magically brought back from ashes. Bulgakov, according to Elena's diary, worked on the novel almost until his dying breath. The same is true of Elena. She passed away in 1970, but before that, she succeeded in getting the manuscript that she was so dedicated to published, and even in the original form that she so deeply respected, even if it was far from home. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Viktor Martinovich. He was born in Belarus. In 2008, he defended his PhD dissertation in art history at the Academy of Arts in Vilnius, devoted to the Vitebsk years of Marc Chagall, and later published 2 monographs based on his research. Since 2008, he has been associate professor at the European Humanities University, a private university founded in 1992 in Minsk, but expelled from the country in 2004, and since then based in Vilnius. Viktor has authored multiple books on creative fiction and play, which have been translated into foreign languages and staged in theaters worldwide. This year, he is a Fulbright Research Fellow based at Hunter College.
As you may understand by my profile, I'm not here now as a scientist. I'm here more like a lab mouse, just somebody to tell a story, to make you think, and not to reflect on the story much. I want to illustrate my paper with this picture, and I want to ask, does anybody know what picture is it and how is it connected to the idea of banning the books? I intentionally took something from Metropolitan Museum in New York to make it more familiar to you. Do you know it? If anybody knows, please raise a hand. No? Okay, the story is very beautiful, but I will not tell it to you. So, how to ban a book in the internet era, Reflections from Belarus. It was early autumn of 2009 when my debut novel, Paranoia, was published in Russia. In this pretty basic apprentice text, I wanted to express the feeling of social reality in which all connections between people are disrupted by the feeling of mistrust and fear. The feeling that now explains a lot, not only inside Belarus or Russia, but also in communities of people who evacuated from these countries, bringing their paranoia with them. These poisonous seeds that spoil a lot in human relations, we will have to weed out a generation long, if not longer. Obviously, the genre of this novel was a political thriller. Obviously, at the end, everything that tended in the plot to be a paranoia of the main characters came out to be truth. They were really followed, bugged, and then assassinated or imprisoned. What is important, the novel was delivered to Minsk and sold freely for 2 months without any bad consequences. The book published in Russia didn't raise any suspicion in Belarus. Nobody who can make a decision to ban a book never really read books. One more explanation, at that moment, we didn't have visible and influential literature. We had only one private book publisher, Lochvinau, who sold books of 200 or 300 copies. The older generation of writers were already out of the public's focus. Younger ones like Horvat, Filipenko, Bakharevich were only having few people on their readings. Nobody cared about literature on both sides. So after 2 months, I noticed a bookstore advertisement in the subway calling Paranoia a bestseller. This is where my problem started. It came to the media. Independent newspaper Narodnaya Volya published an extract of the novel, and as in any daily media, they emphasize the connection of the novel with current political agenda. Independent newspapers are what is read and monitored carefully and attentively. So a week after this publication, the book was removed from the shelves, and that was again reported by the media. Paranoia was solidly banned, and the ban of this book kept even when times changed. National theaters did performances based on contemporary literature, when writers were allowed on TV and participated in constructing a culture different from the post-Soviet Russian, which we had before and which we have now. And still, it was easier to buy drugs in Minsk in 2019 than the Paranoia novel. Immediately after the ban, somebody took a paper book, scanned it, and downloaded to any pirate library of a Russian-speaking world. This was a time before Kindle and e-books, so experience became new for most of the readers. I became famous, but in very freaky way, not earning a penny from the broad circulation of my text. But it was very visible that as to the wealth of the text, the ban wasn't destroyful. Novel benefited from the ban, and as it became a bestseller as a paper book, it continued to be a champion of downloading, though predictably IST Russia canceled plans to do a second printing. Paranoia very soon was translated to English, German, Finnish, and Swedish. Despite, again, being my weakest text, it received much more attention than later on novels, much more attention than it deserved. I had a feeling at that moment that nobody will ever think about banning a book in the internet era again. My Russian colleagues were saying that we Belarusians, are living in an ancient world where books are not only read massively, but also banned by the state. What an old-fashioned idea to ban a book. Russian friends didn't know that very soon this ancient state of the world would come to them as well. But exactly as it happened with Paranoia novel, before our literature came to an end, there was a short time, about 5 years, when it was allowed to prosper and flourish. By the year 2020, we had a strong and visible literature. We had a Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich. We had Andrew Gorvat's massive show in Kupalovsky Theater. We had 400 readers on average book presentation in Minsk, and book signing session in state-run shops, which lasted over 5 hours. We had a chance. Tragedy that followed might be caused by the feeling that culture was the reason for the appearance of a new kind of citizen which started to behave unpredictably in July-August 2020. And apart from other conspiracy theories explaining what caused the revolution, the money from CIA, the Western paratroopers, etc., this speculation was probably absolutely right. So we decided to ban books again. This time it was performed differently. Militia came to the office of my publisher Kniga Zbor, confiscated all remaining copies of the newest novel, and started a criminal prosecution. Militia shut down all the private publishers specialized on fiction literature. Andrew Yanushkevich spent 5 days in prison, who is a publisher. Militia shut down main private bookshops. Militia arrested the head of the biggest one, Symbol by Pavel Belavus. Ironically, the person who did a lot to promote national culture was blamed in treason of the homeland and received 13 years of prison. These first steps, as happened with the soft ban of Paranoia, didn't dismantle the literature field as it was. Because, for example, before shutting down Symbol by the Pavel Belavus shop, they allowed 5 days for selling out books, calendars, and artifacts. So people organized the long lines, and most of the items were sold out. So we had a feeling that books and culture would somehow win over. What turned the tide is their decision to work with all private medias. When in 2021 they came to Dubai, we didn't realize that it is directly connected to the existence of our literature and culture. We didn't understand that since Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, which blames written words in decay of humanities, all we have now, the collective memory, The very existence of us is encrypted in words and photos and stored on websites, which are easily destroyable. So when they simply blocked Goodbye, it was mirrored in the different post-domain zone. And hence, the brilliant invention came, the idea of naming everything inconvenient the extremism. This new tool became much more useful than simple banning, because it wasn't about punishing extremists. It was for punishing with 6 years of prison those who mention extremists. Sequence of events that started in 2020 was very different from the semi-ban in 2009. Every new extremist formation or a source had the name of a court that forged the decision. They started with media, they continued with contemporary literature, they proceed to our literary classic. My favorite decision, the court of Frunzensky district in Minsk, situated on Dunina Marcinkiewicz Street in Minsk, announces the text The Tale of an Old Man by Dunin Marcinkiewicz, an extremist material. It sounded funny in its absurdity at the moment, but it is not funny now. The text is banned. Everything we created, and I'm making kind of semi-crime by mentioning the text. It's not allowed. Everything we created over past 15 years is destroyed. What is more important, all traces of our existence are unrooted because our victories were recorded only by independent medias, which initially were called extremist formations. Then they lost most of the readers, and now they are losing an opportunity to pay for hosting, to maintain the precious archives containing photo, video, and text evidences of our being. And coming back to the title of my paper, How to Ban a Book in the Internet Era. First, fighting books, you have to start with the cultural landscape that surrounds books, because books do not exist separately. Text can live forever in dark and empty space, but not books. Any publisher from Russia or Belarus will tell you that to make a great novel into a bestseller, you have to enable what they call sarafanное radio. The closest translation is word of mouth. If text is an extremist, nobody will dare to talk about it. And it is silence that kills any book, silence. Because you know that books are made not by writers, but by their readers. As with any virus, as with any virus, fighting with books shall start with elimination of a source of infection. So all private publishers, all institutions that can provide and then irradiate the poison of inconvenient thought shall be physically closed. And the best way to close the venture is to lock the owner of this venture. Otherwise, after shutting down one publishing house, in 2 years you will have to kill the second one, organized by the same owner, as it happened with Januszkiewicz. You have to make most of the readers flee from the country and get them to think that they actually can have the same culture abroad with Tamizdat. And of course, Tamizdat is very, very, very important, but it cannot replace the power of a great book written by a big writer and then read by the majority of citizens inside the country. Abandon hope on e-books and Kindles. Again, electronic text can be spread, it can be read by somebody, it can be influential for some time, as number of investigations made by Medusa, but it is not a book. Book works with eternity. To start the magic, you have to get it published on paper and then spread among readers as an artifact, physical entity. Otherwise, people treat it as an article in Medusa. To summarize, despite the visible decay of broad public interest to literature, fiction texts are the skeleton of culture. Theater, fine arts, music, all this comes later. On the existing frame, past 4 years, I have been observing what happens when literature is surgically removed from the body of a culture. It is a clash of two approaches, one by already compromised Fukuyama, The End of History and The Last Man, and one by Oswald Spengler's The Untergang des Abendlandes, which is getting more and more actual as each of these 100 years it was written before passing. We got used to see Belarus as a failed state, but it might very well be that not only Belarus, but the whole region's failures are the result of the idyllic expectations and road strategies for cultural change from what is named des Abendlandes. Each catastrophe has its ways of prevention, and if not, I'm pretty much sure that after a long while, books will win because they always win. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Viktor. Our next speaker is Roman Utkin, an associate professor of Russian, East European and Eurasian studies, as well as of feminist gender and sexuality studies at Wesleyan University. He specializes in 20th century Russian and Russophone poetry, prose, and visual culture. Roman is the author of Charlottengrad, Russian Culture in Weimar, Berlin, published by Wisconsin University Press in 2023, as well as multiple articles. And the topic of his presentation is Queerography, Mapping Sites of Desire Across Borders.
Thank you so much, Mark. Good morning. Thank you so much for your very moving presentation, Viktor, and the closing words about books always winning. I think I just want to kind of pause for a moment and to appreciate the fierce optimism of the phrase, because I certainly want to subscribe to it as well. And thank you, Nicole, to you as well, because even though my topic is on queer books in Russian, and I was wondering how our panel is going to fit together, but in fact, it fits really nicely because, Nicole, as you showed, the reality on the ground is much more complicated, and there are loopholes of various kind, be it personal relationships or actual loopholes in the law that are being evaded in order to publish something. And the reality that is very much against the totalitarian model of control and how Stalin controlled everything, right? And Viktor, with your presentation on how to ban a book in the internet era, my presentation today, which really isn't going to be a scripted presentation, but much more of an exploration and a presentation of some of the most notable books on LGBTQ-related topics, is really addressing this question as well. So if really banning a book per se doesn't stop it from circulating widely, so what should we then, how should we think about the banning and censorship, right? So to what extent should we still be committed to print-published books? Okay, so I am going to begin first by explaining the title of Queerography. I am taking it from Karen Shainian's series called Queerography in Russian, by analogy with geography, though of course it sounds not unlike queer writing, right? Queerography too. And so there is that ambivalence there, but I'm taking it from Karen Shainian, who is now in exile in Berlin. And he created this series that was meant to be a 12-series large sort of film in 12 parts. And let me quote what he said in an interview. I decided that I'd like to film how the most diverse groups of queer people live beyond Moscow and Petersburg. That's the most invisible category of people, it seems to me. There's absolutely nothing filmed about them in Russia. I've articulated the idea in the following way. I wanted to show how real people live in various cities of Russia far away from the capital, and to show that they can be happy there. And obviously, it's not 12, it's only 6 films that were made, and really in the most diverse of locations. As you can see, we have Yekaterinburg in the Urals, Kazan, which is my hometown, the capital of Tatarstan, Novosibirsk, Irkutsk, Kaliningrad, and Vladivostok in the Far East. And queerography, given what Karen's sort of artist statement here, what really matters in the era when in the internet era, when technically a book can't really be banned in that it can't really be prevented from circulation. What matters is how the book is told and what kind of story that the book is saying. So that's my guiding principle in selecting some of the titles that I'll talk about today, in that can't really ban a book. What really matters is what the book is about and the kind of communities the books are highlighting, right? Okay, so first, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. I don't want to assume that we are, just with the criminalization of queerness in Russia today. As you may know, queerness was not criminalized in the Russian Federation from 1993 until 2013. So in the Soviet Union, male homosexuality was criminalized, and punishable for up to 5 years in prison. And women, though not technically subjected to prison time, were often forced into psychiatric treatment. And then in 2013, we have this first censorship law that essentially outlaws any affirmative mention of queer lives and queer existence, so-called gay propaganda law. And then in 2022, this law is ultimately extended to everyone. And this is after the Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February. The law is passed as soon as May. And then in 2023, in the fall, medical care for trans individuals is outlawed, and basically it is ultimately illegal to be transgender in Russia today. But here, again, the point being that it's a very bleak picture, but at the same time, the reality on the ground is much more complicated than any kind of totalitarian model can account for. Also, literature here plays a key role, because in 1933, when in Stalin's Soviet Union, when homosexuality is criminalized, Maxim Gorky, the major writer and ultimately the father of Soviet literature, played a crucial role by publishing an op-ed, what we would call today, called Proletarian Humanism, in both Pravda and Izvestia, linking fascism in Germany with homosexuality, and with a famous phrase, eradicate homosexuality and fascism will disappear. And in 2022, the origins of this, why would you extend this anti-LGBT censorship law to everyone? Well, there is also a book here at the core of it. And the book is Katerina Silvanova's Elena Malesova's Summer in a Pioneer Tie, which is over 500 pages long. It really is a heavy tome. And it had some extraordinary print run, an absolute bestseller, so much so. Of course, it focuses, it's set in 1986 in a pioneer camp where two pioneer boys fall in love with one another, and it's very much a teenage boy romance. And however, there were people who were not amused. First and foremost, it was Zakhar Prilepin, the probably chief propagandist and also a writer in Russia today. And then the book made it onto Dmitry Kiselyov's show and Nikita Mikhalkov's show Besagon. And so that is not to say that the book is really necessarily worth all of this attention, but what it did do, it put it on the map for the censors, right? Who, I absolutely agree, Viktor, with you, they do not read books. What matters is whenever there is a sufficient media attention. And so this novel about two pioneers in 1986 essentially forced a new legislation, and then MP Hinstein in the Russian parliament motioned to ban all affirmative representation of queerness in all possible media genres. I'm not going to translate Zakhar Prilepin for those of you who don't read Russian, only because I just don't want to spread his vitriol. Nevertheless, the novel remains incredibly popular, so here you can see some of the fan art. It really is completely viral with teenagers in Russia today. Also, the title in Russian, Leto в пионерском галстуке, abbreviates to LVPG, and that's how it's referred to, and which is not unlike LGBT, something that Dmitry Kiselyov also picked up on and said, well, this is actually the case of LGBT propaganda. But at any rate, I'm really glad that Mark is here because Mark was a co-organizer together with Vlad Strukov of an extraordinary conference just about a month ago at Columbia, the Harriman Institute, called Criminalized Again, Cultures of LGBTQI+ in Search of Freedom. And it was extraordinary conference, not least because of its size. I think it really was the first conference. It was that big, that interdisciplinary, so thank you, Mark, again. But what I'm going to do today in my presentation is to present to you what I myself have learned about queer Russian book publishing at this conference, linking the two endeavors and enterprises, and particularly I will be drawing on 3 papers by Jose Alaniz on queer comics, Ekaterina Tutatina on queer young adult literature in Russia and the way growth despite censorship, and Julie Cassiday's paper on Summer in a Pioneer Tie. So yeah, boys love meets girl power in Putin's Russia. By girl power, it's the girl purchasing power. Anything that is popular with teenage girls really becomes not only a media sensation, but also an incredibly profitable enterprise. Okay, so, and yes, I'm going to structure my remarks in 2 parts. First, I will talk about queer books in Russia itself, and then whatever happens in the diaspora on this topic and the queerography framework. Now, here is some data on top 5 bestsellers in Russia at the time that Russia invaded Ukraine in February and immediately thereafter. So in the left column, you see the most popular books in Russian, and on the right, translated literature. And so this data is from the Российская книжная палата, Russia's book chamber, and I take this from Ekaterina Tutanina's presentation. Now, this data is no longer available online. As you may expect, the Russian internet is being scrubbed very regularly to create this appearance that life didn't exist before 2022. So, but nevertheless, I did verify this data through various blogs and other publications. So you can see that in the Russian column, we have Summer in a Pioneer Tie, but also О чем молчит ласточка, which I translated as What Doesn't the Swallow Say, which is a sequel to Summer in a Pioneer Tie. And these 2 books are the top 2 books, with a cumulative print run of over 300,000 copies sold. So this is really an impressive indicator for a Russian book. And also, not just a queer book, but a queer teenager love story. Now, and Nicole, Master and Margarita remains in top 5, as is Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky. And Fyodor Nichitai, Let the Land of the Kings. It's also it's a fanfic kind of a book that initially existed only online. But then what often happens is when there is an amateur literary product that becomes incredibly popular with the audiences, huge publishing houses swoop in and say, we would love to publish this, and they do. And then they make tons and tons of money. On the right column, you see the translated literature's top 5, and little surprise that it's 1984 at the very top. But then you see Monsieur Tongsu, Heaven Official's Blessings, Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Nora Sakavich's The Foxhole Court, and Adam Silvera's They Both Die at the End. Now, what I can tell you is that except for George Orwell's 1984, the rest of them are queer books or queer-themed books. So, and here we have a picture. So what also is really quite incredible is that the Heaven Official's Blessings, the Foxhole Court, and They Both Die at the End, they're technically young adult fiction. It's just also, again, the purchasing power of teenagers. And now, what is even more extraordinary is that the Heaven Official's Blessings by Monsieur Tongsu is written in the genre of danmei, which is in itself a derivative of manga, but it focuses specifically on love between 2 boys. So and also the author is Chinese, and it's a Chinese novel, and it's a huge enterprise. I think it's like in 13 volumes. It can still be bought in Russia today. So again, if censors or whoever is making decisions not reading books, this is a Chinese gay romance series that is extremely successful. Also on the cover, those are two boys, right? So, well, now, the Foxhole Court and Adam Silvera's. Adam Silvera is an American, as is Nora Sakovich. Both are American young adult novels that feature queer relationships between two men. But with the Dan May, and this is I'm drawing from Julie Cassiday's presentation at Mark and Vlad's Criminalized Again Culture, is that it's all derives from manga. So, and we have this Chinese version, but Summer in the Pioneer Thai and What Doesn't the Swallow Say are actually also part of this genre, which is called BL or yaoi, or BL is an abbreviation of boys love. And it is, apparently, I was just enlightened, an incredibly successful genre of books that always features two boys in love and that are mainly read by teenage girls. So, whatever the case may be, the Russian books are now banned, and the authors have been declared foreign agents, and so they live in exile. However, you can still buy these books in Kazakhstan, and nobody's asking any questions. Again, Viktor, I'm thinking about your presentation in terms of the neighboring countries in the region. All right, so, well, if this is interesting, wait until I have the next slide. So these are also books that I mainly just for the covers. So on the left, you see Drek Gilb, which is a pen name of a Russian author, which is Goida, and it's a story, softly homoerotic novel that is featuring the relationship between Ivan the Terrible and Fyodor Basmanov. I think Sergei Eisenstein would be very much a fan. During the times of Oprichina, this is medieval Russia, Rus, Muscovy, really, and Daria Budantsev's Mediatory is a supernatural kind of a narrative that is featuring two women who have a very tense, perhaps romantically charged relationship. Now, what is important about these two, they're being sold, but the authors censored themselves. So they tweaked the pages of the text in order to not have any major questions being asked. And Budantseva even made a public statement about this, explaining why she decided to tone down the homosexuality of the book. Going forward, yes, so talking about the fan fiction, or fanfiki as they're called in Russian, there is this extraordinary series called Bessmertny, which is from Kощей Bessmertny by the author Coriander. This was an incredible online success. Exmo is the commercial publisher in Russia, and they picked it up in 2022. This book is still being sold. It's a graphic novel that is featuring, it's kind of an LGBTQ retelling of Russian folklore, mainly the Kощей the Deathless, with Ivanushka Durachok and Kощей the Deathless rapes Ivanushka Durachok, and then they have a love affair for the rest of however many tomes. It's actually very disturbing. I mean, some of the scenes of sexual violence. Okay, but again, I double-checked all of these. These are still available for purchase in Russia. Now, what is also available for purchase in Russia are books that are are landmark publications in America. So on the left, you see Craig Thompson's Blankets from 2003, Russian translation 2017, still is being you can buy it in Russia today. It's a coming out narrative, but not a sexuality coming out narrative, but a coming out narrative of no longer believing in God and no longer being Christian, of a young boy who is from a fundamentalist Christian family in the American South who goes into a summer camp, falls in love with the girl, tells her the stories of how he was molested. He and his brother were molested by their male babysitter, and it's really just kind of extraordinary if you think about the kinds of narratives and what they did in the American context and what they're doing in the Russian context today. And of course, I don't need to tell you more about Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. Yeah, that's Fun Home, and still very much on the shelves. I have to really wrap up, huh? Okay, so anyhow, both books are still being sold. For those of you who don't know, it's a graphic novel about a teenager's relationship with her father who ultimately commits suicide after coming out. Okay, so these are the Russian examples of graphic novels and narratives. Herman Alia's Trans-Siberia and Sasha Baranovskaya's Taina. This is from Jose Alaniz's presentation. Sorry, now I have to move into my second part, which I'm going to do really quickly because I only have 2 minutes left. Going back to, just in terms of strategies of publication. In 2013, after the gay propaganda law was enacted in Russia, Masha Gessen edited this book, which is also available for free online as a PDF download, Gay Propaganda, which featured about half a dozen of stories, love stories of adults, for a change, in Russia. So the ways in which books are mobilized to counter homophobia. So this is from 2013. There was also this project by Alexander Kargaltsev, who is a photographer. This book, Asylum, it's about these very young, very white, very lanky young men in New York in various landscapes. Which is largely kind of a commercial project, but nevertheless merits a mention as a book. Okay, now there is another book, speaking of diaspora, so this is a publication from 2018 in Berlin. We Have Something to Say, which is stories of, it was roughly 24 individuals from the post-Soviet realm, most of them from Ukraine actually, writing in Russian. And this is what, in the introduction, the editor said. Many LGBTQIA individuals, regardless of how LGBTQIA friendly their original families and milieu are, often feel detached from the world that follows heteronormative rules. In the overwhelming majority of movies, books, ads, and songs, princesses passively await princess, gender that's assigned to characters at birth, always aligns with the way they feel on the inside. And there's only one way of living your femininity or masculinity. It's permitted to have only strictly monogamous relationships with people of the very opposite gender and strictly for compulsory reproduction. Regardless of how we resist this, there are too many such images and they weigh on the subconscious, if not consciousness. They force one to feel invisible, wrong, and bad. Often in the conventional West, all people with post-Soviet background are shoved into the same category, Russians. They also assume that we're all heterosexuals and cisgender. We question this assumption. And so, this book was published, was sponsored by the Berlin Senate and 2 other foundations in Germany. It's available for a free download as a PDF if you're interested. You can find it easily online. And I just wanted to highlight the kind of rationale here going from the popularity of young adult fiction in Russia and into the kinds of strategies for publication in the diaspora. So again, from the introduction, this collection is one of the very first attempts at queer migrant expression in writing, but in reality only a small number of individuals can actually do the expressing of themselves because many queer migrants and immigrants have no time to write beautiful poems and stories about their experiences because they gotta work 3 jobs or because reflecting on the immigrant experience, which is often associated with discrimination and trauma, is painful and scary. But at the same time, this reflection yields new publications too. So there was Evgeny Shtorn's Refugee Chronicles, which was originally published as a series of YouTube posts, really an extraordinary book, I must say. Then there is another way in which so this is a book called With Love from Russia by Vlad Zorin. And it's not only photography, but also personal stories. It's structured as a questionnaire, like a high school anketa. Those of you who know this phenomenon in Russian schools, with questions such as what's your experience, favorite position, duration of sex, masturbation, do you prefer condoms, lube, sex toy, or oral sex, etc. And or also, what do you think about having children, becoming a parent, etc. And really a moving book in many ways, first sold in Russia, sold out completely, featured in the Vogue magazine, on TV Rain, but and then now there is a second printing, but this time it was published in France, and Vlad Zorin also lives in Paris. So there's kind of another approach. Also, there are two novels, Mark, I'm almost done, two novels that are very fresh. So on the left, we have Sergei Chekalov's Dangerous Species, and on the right, Artem Mozgovoy's Spring in Siberia. Both novels are, here they are really not for the Russian audience. These are Russian authors. Mozgovoy writes he lives in Brussels, writes in English and Russian. The novel is written in English. And on the left, Sergei Chekalov's novel is written in French. Both novels are really very, for lack of a better word, Russophobic and kind of exploit and traffic in stereotypes about kind of Russia's darkness and Russian homophobia. All of it is also, which is also true, but again, the target audience here are the Western audiences, and Mozgovoy secured blurbs from Ocean Vuong, Stephen Fry, and Edmund White. So that is to say, these are, again, not for Russian audiences necessarily, but worthy of attention, and very, very new books. And I will end with this book, which I think is probably the most notable in what I've presented here. This is Sergei Davylov Springfield, a novel, or really more of a novella, written during the pandemic in Russia. It's based in the southern European Russia's region of the Samara Oblast. It's in Samara and Tolyatti, and the novel is kind of, again, it's a love story between two, this time it's not teenagers, but college students, and ways in which they're imagining their escape from what they see as this sort of repressive, oppressive, economically depressed city of Tolyatti, which is home to the Avtovaz factory. And instead, they imagined themselves living in Illinois, if not in Chicago, then in Springfield. So, yeah, and I'll just end with a quote from Springfield. «Я шел по городу и думал, что такое Тольятти. Это молодой парень, которому крупно не повезло. Ради его рождения затопили целый Ставрополь на Волге, и лучшие молодые умы съезжались в степь, чтобы построить город будущего и поторопить время». And so that is the entire city of Togliatti, which is named after an Italian communist, when they started building the big car plant there, came into existence because the previous 18th century town of Stavropol na Volga had to be completely flooded for the construction of the hydroelectric dam, and how this metaphor of an ancient city or an older city being destroyed to give birth to a new city that is now in decline is then mapped onto contemporary Russia. And of course, Sergei Davydov himself lives in exile, and the book itself is published as the very first book in the new Tamizdat Press Freedom Letters. Okay, sorry I went on too long, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Abusing my power of a moderator, I want to ask the first question to all participants. So Viktor's talk sort of connected it all, and it's a very, very powerful text that you read. But your conclusion, as everybody remembers in this room, was that Tamizdat cannot replace books published at home. E-books cannot replace a real book. But the question to all of you, this is true, this is correct, but we are dealing with situations when books cannot be published at home, and when e-books are more available than printed books. So what are the strategies that can make Tamizdat and e-publishing more effective, more available, more shortening the distance between books and readers, based on Bulgakov's experience, because you have it, right? Based on today's experience of LGBT writing, and based on the experience that Viktor was referring to. So what do you think? Nicole?
I suppose I'll start chronologically. Well, I think that the sort of strategies that become successful in the case of Bulgakov are, however odd it may seem, a little bit of deception, a little bit of role-playing on the part of Ilyana Bulgakova, but also just very tireless dedication. As I tried to demonstrate in my presentation, it seems, based on all of her personal statements, that all of the compromises that she had to agree to initially to see the novel published were really, really intensely painful for her and went against everything that she believed. If you read her diary further, she comes across as a person almost religiously dedicated to the concept of a manuscript. Even these exact diaries, the editor mentions that she would write and rewrite them many, many times over, editing them, even though they were personal diaries that at the time she did not even intend to have published. And so to have a person like that, again, so dedicated to the concept of the original, willing to make these compromises just to see the work get out in some form, banking on the fact that later she could devise a path to see the original published, I think it shows that this willingness to compromise is not necessarily like a lack of dedication to the original or some kind of dishonesty, but just doing what you have to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Viktor, please.
On my feeling, the role of Tamizdat is the role of zoo. You know, you have to put some endangered species in isolation to keep it alive until the circumstances will be okay to let it into the wild. Yeah, to open the doors. Because I really understand how important the fact that we preserved some literary species that have been published in 20s or 30s, but the moment they appeared in Russia, for example, in the beginning of 90s, was the moment when they were read properly, when they were when they gained the power to change things, because literature is a pure magic. It can change everything. So they started to work with consciousness, with mass consciousness, at the moment when they reached the mass reader who is inside the country, not outside, unfortunately. So this is my pessimistic vision.
Thank you.
I will actually go back, Viktor, to your presentation, and when you said you really put it very beautifully, the point about books being made by readers, and that to a large extent literature depends on readership. So my answer is going to be not exactly intellectual. I will say it's really perhaps our moral obligation to buy these books and to pay for these books. Because if we want to have this literature, if we want the writers to actually, as the authors of this volume put it in the introduction, they have to survive, right? So in addition to needing to create beautiful literature in the tradition of great names, but at the end of the day, if you want to read good books and if you want books to stand up to dictatorships, then maybe in authoritarian regimes, maybe we should really think more seriously about our own habits of supporting artists. And so buying books, I understand that everything is pirated and everything can be found online, but it's important to show solidarity not only by word but also materially too. So.
Thank you so much. I'm moved by all three talks, and I have a question that I think can apply to all three of you. Thinking about the unauthorized translations, authorized translations, circulation, distribution of books. I know Ivan Turgenev complained about unauthorized translations in the late 19th century, that there was non-reciprocal exchanges where Russian writers were being translated in Western Europe, and they got nothing, not a dime for it, where French writers were getting major distribution rights in Russia and making money. So I'm wondering for Nicole whether you can comment maybe a little bit about the 1930s and the unauthorized translations, as well as whether Elena Bulgakova negotiated any rights for that Estonian translation. For Viktor, I'm wondering if the current sad situation with writers in Belarus and Ukraine, there is a lot of translating, very good translating going on. I know it's not the same as publishing in the country, but how are the writers finding the current climate for negotiating? I mean, books win, but writers need to live. So if you could comment on the current status of that. And for Roman, I'm wondering about these odd translations from, this Chinese work, for example, and who's making money off of that. And just a comment on Greenfield, we had a new acquisitions display with Springfield, sorry. We had this book on display at the University of Toronto Library, and it disappeared. It was not checked out, and I am so curious. I'm hoping someone surreptitiously took it to a Carol and has been reading it. I'm hoping it wasn't discarded, and so it's very interesting. So I hope that I captured all.
It's a sign of popularity. Stolen books. So shall we collect a few questions?
Indeed, a wonderfully poignant panel. I have a question for Roma and for Nicole. For Roma, one of the questions that really intrigues me is how this wave of the books being endangered, and thank you so much for a beautiful zoo metaphor, is different from the previous waves. What have we learned from the last time? Obviously, the main innovation being internet and everything that it offers us and everything that it prohibits us. And one of these things is fanfic. Going back to the whole thing that the writer is made by the reader, but here this is literally the case. So I just want to give you as a question, idea, moment from using. So what is different now for us because of the existence of the fan fiction, especially as you showed us, and some of the parents in the room know anyway, in this case where fan fiction is the phenomenon of the true passion, I would say. So this is my question. And for Nicole, could you talk more? And I really appreciated that you compared Simonov to Voland. I see it. Could you talk a little bit more about his relationship, his role in this case? Because again, what he did for the Soviet literature and art is, for me personally, what I've been thinking, of course, what he did for Alexei German. He basically made Alexei German possible on some level, that his movies were not immediately shelved and washed away. So if you could talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
All right, I see on my list Yasha and Sorin, but let us give the word to speakers, and then we'll collect more questions. All right?
Nicole, please.
Yeah, in the same order.
Yes, so thank you, first of all, for all of your questions. I'll address your second question first about Elena Bulgakova and the Estonian translation. The only interaction that she had with this, and I owe all of my knowledge to this to Kupsazanov's article, is that essentially the Estonian team purposefully did not seek her permission in advance because they knew that she was quite possessive of Bulgakov's manuscripts and that she often reacted quite aggressively to translations of his other works or publications of his other works that occurred without her knowledge, like the publication of Собачье сердце by YMCA Press. And essentially, I think the logic there was that it's better to seek forgiveness than ask permission. And so after the Estonian publication came out as a book form, the editor-in-chief of Estiramat, Axel Tamm, he came to Moscow, gave the book to Diana Bulgakova, and she was thrilled. She was so grateful to have it as a physical book, finally, within the Soviet Union, that, as I said, in return, she showed him the Tamizdat publications, the uncensored ones that she had. And this was based on everything we know, the first time that this Estonian team had seen the uncensored variant. And as for your first question about the unauthorized translations of Bulgakov that were taking place in the 1930s, I think the really interesting thing is that based on at least the letter that I pulled up and some of the others, what he really objected to the most was, I think, on reasons of fear, because this line that the French translator had invented, mentioning Stalin and Lenin's names, I think he believed could have gotten him into very serious trouble. And that is what he emphasizes in all of his letters, that it's unacceptable for Soviet figures' names, for Soviet leaders' names to be said in this comedic format. This is an outrage, this is a violation. And this is also the tone that he takes in practically all of the letters in which he complains about unauthorized translations. I think that the tone of this is very much engineered to make himself seem like a good Soviet citizen, to kind of distance himself from any kind of trouble that might occur. And Polina, thank you so much for your question as well. On the role of Konstantin Simonov, it's really, really difficult to discuss this without knowing all of the facts. And the reason that we don't know all of the facts is that a lot of these communications would be in Diana Bulgakova's archive, which the researcher Yanovskaya describes as practically inaccessible even to her at the time, and certainly inaccessible to me. But I think the main role that he had was essentially of being the sort of like advisor, to use the old quote, like a guide, philosopher, and friend to Diana Bulgakova as she worked towards this publication. So Yanovskaya alleges that he had advised her to get the novel published in any form, even censored, and essentially there was, from what she implies, like a promise there that he would help get it published in the uncensored variant later on. And based on what we can tell, he made good on his promise. But again, a lot of his role is really from the shadows and from this sort of approval and blessing rather than in concrete actions. Although there were concrete actions as well, such as the foreword that he wrote for the Moskva publication, and the fact that this like letter from the Soviet Union of Writers, which allowed the uncensored version to come out in the Italian publication. So, thank you for your questions.
Okay, as to the unauthorized translations, you know, in spite of the United States, in Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and some other countries of post-Soviet space, the writer is treated as a respected criminal, as a godfather. And the godfather cannot work, you know. If you have a proper work, you are not a proper godfather, you are not a respected criminal. So I'm a not respected criminal, I'm not a proper writer because I have a proper job, I teach at the university. That's why I'm misrespected by the other criminals. I mean, other writers say that, come on, you are not a proper writer because you are not living out of your books. But what I can tell that I have a feeling that a contemporary fiction writer, he lives out of translations first, then second from film rights, and the third source and biggest source of my income is translation, theater right, and film rights. So when my novel Revolution, the latest one, was sold to German Schauspielhaus, which is the biggest drama theater in the German-speaking world, I received the proposal, which, like of 10 years of my writings, I received more than I would receive for 10 years of my writings sold in Germany. So it's That's why I ask, please spread my text as much as you can. I don't care about pennies that I can get from translations. This is my vision. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. On the translation question, I think on the one hand, clearly there are translations. I didn't look into who translates them, but for me, what's more interesting is this cultural translation, ways in which these forms of BL and Dainmei genre are being essentially borrowed and written with material from Russia, and that's where I started with queerography. What really is important is not necessarily to just take a story that is set in medieval China, but to then imagine something similar with Gaither project, where it's Ivan the Terrible and Basmanov. So definitely, I think there's as much cultural translation as there is actual translation. And on Polina's question of what have we learned from the previous waves, can we ever learn? I'm not really sure that if there is, and how to measure really, if there is any kind of continuity among the waves, and if the waves really talk to one another, and this really was the case between the first and the second, and the second and the third, and the third and the fourth. So what I will say is, what I found striking is that in the introduction to Springfield by the publisher Georgi Rushadze, he says, well, I found this novel on Facebook, and whoever posted it said, это посильнее Эдички. And so this will be stronger, more intense than It's Me, Eddie by Eduard Limonov. And so Limonov somehow is a reference point. And then I read about the Sergei Chikalov's Dangerous Species from the film critic Zinaida Pronchenko, who also was talking about, and she really did not like that novel, but she was also her only reference point was Limonov, again, and she was saying, если у Лимонова мизантропия, то у Чекалова russophobia. So, and if Limonov wrote in this misanthropic mode key, then Chekalov, according to Pronchenko, is indulging in russophobia. But I also then was thinking that if you might remember in the introduction to Это я Эдичка, there's an author's note where Limonov is being presented to the reader, and it says that he grew up в Харькове, этом Детройте России. So that he grew up in Kharkiv, this Detroit of Russia. So, which obviously in today's context is rather wild to hear. So, and yeah, I think it's interesting that Limonov is having this moment as a reference point currently. With fan fiction, I'm not a fan, so I can't say much, but I know that it is a tsunami of a phenomenon. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, for someone who's been working on this textual embodiment that Olga Matic referred to as Tamizdat as, it's a field trip for me, this part of the conference. But this also brings me, in a sense, to Mark's talk yesterday on Abram Terz as Michel Foucault, and namely to Foucault's concept of docile body, right? And the whole question of that I'm not sure how much of it is an actual question, but it would be interesting to hear a bit more about just what makes the body of a book that is punished, as in Foucault's Discipline and Punish, versus, as he calls it, the spirit, which in the Middle Ages is not what was being punished, right? It was the body, like the hand, the limb, the head, etc. And I just couldn't help resisting this thread throughout all your presentations, from the manuscript to the internet, as in a sense almost the opposite of the manuscript. But how does it build on Foucault's dichotomy between the body and the spirit, the internet, which he hardly kind of lived to see really. And of course, to Roman's not only body in the kind of bodily sense, but also the embodiment of these books abroad, right? Because every publication, no matter where, but perhaps especially the farther away from the place where it's written, whenever that happens, it's kind of also extending this spectrum between the spirit and the body in Foucauldian terms. And Mark, thank you for kind of making me think about this, because Terz, even if he or they are not part of this panel, as a point of discussion that's kind of hovers, of course, in the air. Or, yeah, if you have any thoughts about this, I think it would be tremendous also to hear as we transition to the non-academic part of the conference with Elena Kostyuchenko's keynote, and then evidence from the people who facilitate this embodiment of books being written as publishers. Thank you.
I want to just, I'm going to keep it short because, but I was sort of fascinated by the literary landscape that opened up here, right, from fan fiction to Bulgakov to political thriller, and I'm sort of fixated on the notion of literary genre lately, and I was wondering about that, right? And yesterday I was trying to think of Kundera's resistance to being fixed in a genre, right? So it's almost as if he was constructing this like elaborate strategy to not be trapped in anti-communist fiction, but not be trapped in the idea that I'm writing a banned book, right? So I guess this is for a question for everyone, but I'm curious, of course, Viktor, as a writer, how do you on the one hand you claimed sort of a banned book kind of brings attention, but how do you overcome the risk of just being limited to that, right? So I think that's kind of the problem of genre, right? Because we have the traditional literary genres that are evolving. We can talk about that for a long time, but then you have this kind of like haphazard, extra literary genres, right? Like anti-communist fiction a genre, is the queer book banned in Alabama genre, or and so on.
As to Yasha's question, I would dodge the Foucault's bullet. I would dodge it because in our university past 5 years we try not to No, I respect Foucault and I love him, but what I want to convert this question to is that the book, this respected book, this beautiful book, has two parts. It has a body and the soul, and it is the body of this book is the thing that I hold in my hands, and it is so easy to kill this body. And the soul of this book is the text that is written, and the internet is a beautiful compartment, beautiful zoo for banned book's soul, to hold the soul of the banned book. But as any bodiless creature, the book that has no body will not exist properly. So it's like for some mediums, for somebody who was talking to spirits, to become book, it has to be, again, reincarnate to somebody. So that's why I think the Foucaultian approach to the idea of banning the body of the book is very effective. So you can actually ban the book. This is what comes out from Foucault's approach to the thing. But the book is immortal because it has soul that can't be killed. So yeah, this is my vision of it. But I think you were right, Yasha. This is not a question. It's just a beautiful idea that, yeah, it shall be.
This is the best answer. Robert, would you like to say
Wait, but Nicole also was asked. Genre.
The one thing that I wanted to add on to this beautiful concept between the body and the soul of the book is, I didn't, for my own reasons of space, I didn't get to mention this in my presentation, but Master Margarita existed in a sort of disembodied form for quite a long time as it was being written and before it was published, because as Bulgakov wrote it, he read it out loud very often to many people, and Elena Bulgakova continued this tradition before she was able to finally bring it to publication and before she was even able to have a full manuscript. So there's a sort of oral tradition aspect to it. And I will also mention a really incredible case of this. I haven't been able to find much or great sourcing on this so far, but I'm looking into the matter that allegedly Elena Bulgakova, when she was in evacuation in Tashkent, she would organize readings of Master Margarita to people in her circle who were also in evacuation in Tashkent, including Anna Akhmatova. They apparently read this book out loud to others together, which is, at least from what I've gathered, quite in character for Elena Bulgakova, but extremely out of character for Akhmatova. So I think this sort of like, and yet despite this disembodied, I guess, oral publication that she was able to bring about, she was again so dedicated over the course of decades to getting this physical body out. And I think that is also why she was so grateful to see it in an actual book form rather than even this like split in half body of the journal publication. So yeah, I think that just speaks to your point as well.
Okay, Mark, I was so sorry to miss your presentation with the best title I've seen in a while. So I can't quite maybe address Yasha's question directly. But what I would like to maybe think about for a second is in terms of material culture and material history of what is happening to the books. Because after the initial quote-unquote gay propaganda law in 2013, publishers, not so much publishers, but booksellers started wrapping books into plastic. Right, and I think that in itself is just a fascinating part of this history too, in that the book exists in its hefty material shell, but yet, and then it's wrapped, and then there is an additional label on it that it is 18 plus. And whenever I pass by a bookstore here in the US, and you probably know this whole of a secret book stand where it's a book that's wrapped into brown paper, you don't know what it is, it's going to be a surprise. And it's the inverse of it, right, in Russian bookstores. And again, who does it? Why do they do it? But does it really in any way draw any more attention to a book? How does it influence the patterns of behavior of readers, both purchasing and reading? And I think there is this Foucauldian connection in terms of sociology of literature too, right? So that's just the only thing that I would mention. And Soren, to your question on genre, I think to me, the most striking of the case studies I've presented was the French and the novel that in French and in English, in that they very much are written into a genre of a suffering person, a protagonist from the repressive regime. And that in itself is just sort of this gleefully embraced project, which to me from the beginning undermines the project itself. Actually, in terms of genre, Springfield, this one, is very difficult to identify. It really is just so hybrid and absolutely, it has this precisely this beautiful quality because it's so elusive and it's so difficult to capture into a category of genre at all, right? So.
I'd like to thank you for these presentations because I think that there is a common issue that we discussed in those days, which is the role of immigration in keeping alive the voices of who are silenced in different heroes, historical heroes. So this common pattern of authoritarian systems in silenced the voices of new inakamizlia. So the queer voices has Roman show has reminds of Soviet Union, but also, for example, fascist Italy, when the L'Unità, the journal founded by Gramsci, exiliated in France during the fascist era. So the important role of the emigration of exiliated voices in continuing to express freely themselves. So thank you for this opportunity. And after, I have a curiosity, because Roman, you talks about this mapping the sites of desire, and I was wondering if you are thinking to use some digital tools for visualize these great works that you are doing. So the idea to recollect this data about the activism outside of the borders, it could be also created, no, in a way that we. So you can also visualize this web of activists. So if you used, so the question is, the curiosity is, you have this digital aspect. Are you thinking about the digital visualization of your data or not? Sorry.
Well, let's make this a we answer, and let's collaborate and think about it more together.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to express my gratitude to participants of this wonderful panel and to you all for your great questions and attention. Thank you so much.